In this video, we will discuss the Chronicler and their return from exile. In the previous video in this series, we discussed the events leading up to the destruction of the First Temple. This happened during the Neo-Babylonian period in 586 BCE. It's a dark time for the Jews, with the people of Judah and their homeland of Jerusalem destroyed by the Babylonians, and the people of Judah are now in exile. Persian forces are beginning to rise in the area, conquering the Babylonians. They are a possible new threat to the already struggling Jews, who have lost their temple, which much of their religion was focused on, and sacrifices could only be made at this temple. So the Jews are now faced with a crisis on how to keep worshiping Yahweh. They feel hopeless because Yahweh was supposed to protect them, and the temple, which is now destroyed, was believed to house the presence of Yahweh. As the Jews are faced with these challenges, they must now decide how to worship Yahweh without the temple, and wonder if Yahweh is even real. The Babylonians ruled as the chief world power of the ancient Near East, from sometime around 600, possibly up to a decade or two before this, through 539 BCE. They conquered Assyria, along with destroying Jerusalem, and made Assyria a province within Babylonia. Around 549, however, the Persians, under Cyrus the Great, started vying for this position. They conquered other nations, and in 539 BCE, Babylonia was on the receiving end of this conquering, and was reduced from being the major world power to simply a Persian province. Now, before this time, we of course have the Babylonian exile, which occurs after the destruction of the First Temple and the Babylonians' capturing of Jerusalem. The Israelites are exiled from their homeland and have no more temple to make sacrifices or worship at. What this leads to during this exilic period is the building of some, not many at this point, some synagogues, which are essentially houses of assembly, or in Hebrew, Bet Knesset. These functioned as sort of a makeshift temple, though sacrifices could not be made there, because the Temple Mount was the only place that sacrifices could be made by most Jews' understanding of the Torah. Synagogues pop up quite a bit more as we get to the destruction of the Second Temple, which we'll talk about towards the end of this course. So this Persian conquest, leading up to 539 BCE, leads us into the reign of Cyrus the Great and his successors, which we call the Persian period, which spans until 332 BCE. Around the year 517, though there's no specific date that we have here, we have the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. This was not something that the Jews had to sneak around to do, but was actually something that the Persians not only allowed, but actually provided resources for. Almost 2 centuries later, Alexander the Great, the famous Greek warrior and ruler, ended up conquering the Persians, beginning the Hellenistic period. Hellas is the Greek word for Greece, which is where we get this name from. We'll pick this timeline back up later when we get to later texts and apocalyptic literature. What's significant here in our timeline, for our purposes in this course, is the return to Jerusalem. Around the year 517, the Jews are allowed to rebuild their temple under the Persian Empire. Now, this isn't during the reign of Cyrus the Great or Cyrus II, but Cyrus the Great is the one who kind of starts this in motion. He issues a decree that the temple is to be rebuilt and that the Jews should come back to their homeland. Cyrus is viewed quite positively in the Hebrew Bible, possibly different than we would expect, seeing what we've seen of Babylonian rulers in the past. Isaiah 45:1, for example, says, "Thus says the Lord to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I have grasped to subdue nations before him, and strip kings of their robes, to open doors before him, and the gate shall not be closed. Now what's interesting here in the Hebrew is this word anointed. We see this in English as anointed or anointed one, the anointed one of Yahweh. But in the Hebrew we have the root word at least, Mashiach. Mashiach might sound familiar to you if you know the word Messiah, which simply means anointed one. What we see here in Isaiah is Cyrus being referred to as the Messiah. And when we talk about the Messiah in the Hebrew Bible, there are different ideas throughout the Hebrew Bible and throughout other Jewish texts as well. But it's interesting to see Cyrus referred to as this Messiah or Mashiach here. Now, while Cyrus was responsible for allowing the Jews to return to their homeland, it was another Persian king, Darius the Great or Darius the First, who not only allowed for the rebuilding of the temple, but provided resources for it, following a decree made about this during Cyrus's rule. Now, we must not assume that either Darius or Cyrus converted to the Israelite religion. Darius was a Zoroastrian, and Cyrus possibly was as well. Both rulers allowed for religious pluralism as long as their followers were peaceful. We know quite a bit about this period when the Persians ruled the Israelites from Ezra and Nehemiah, so we'll turn our attention there. Now, Ezra and Nehemiah might look somewhat odd as a hyphenated group. In most of our Bibles, we see the text separately. Originally, however, they were one composition, which we can see if we look at the end of Ezra and the beginning of Nehemiah. Many scholars believe that they were actually a continuation of Chronicles, all written by the same author as a multi-volume set. We refer to this as the chronistic history. Now, we don't know who actually wrote these texts, so most scholars use the name the Chronicler to refer to the author or authors of these texts. Now, there is debate over the authorship, particularly if the Chronicler wrote both Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah, but commonalities in theme, such as a focus on Jerusalem, the temple, and priesthood, writing in the Persian period, etc., help point us to the idea that there might be a similar or the same author of these texts. Now, as you read Chronicles, you might notice that it tells a story we're familiar with. In Chronicles itself, the history read is essentially what we've read in Samuel and Kings, but there are some differences. You might notice some things that the chronicler leaves out, for example, like David and Bathsheba's story, or the kingdom splitting because of Solomon's sins. What we see in Chronicles is an idealized account of this history. While the author of Samuel and Kings clearly had some kind of bias towards the history, the chronicler has an even more biased perspective. One of the reasons for this is the emphasis of the chronicler on the Davidic covenant. Because of the importance of the Davidic covenant, the chronicler portrays David, Solomon, and their descendants as much holier than they seem in the Deuteronomistic history. Saul, however, is portrayed even worse in this text than we see him in Samuel and Kings. Turning back to Ezra and Nehemiah, we see some important figures in these texts. This is what tells the history of the Persian period and the rebuilding of the temple. Just like we had when Judah and Israel were a united monarchy and even separate monarchies, but separate nations, we had a high priest and a king. In Ezra and Nehemiah, we see Yeshua, or Joshua, as he's referred to in some of the prophets, who acts as the high priest, while Zerubbabel is the governor of Judah, who is from the line of David. Now, at this point, and from this point forward, Judah is no longer an independent nation, and will not be again. From this point forward, we see Judah as semi-autonomous. It remains with some autonomy. Zerubbabel is the governor at this point, but it acts as somewhat of a province under the Persian Empire as a whole. Now, Zerubbabel is a very important figure according to what we see in the Hebrew Bible. In Zechariah 4:9, the text claims that he lays the foundation of the temple, and Haggai calls him the signet ring of God. Now, a signet ring is kind of like a notary stamp that you might see today. Kings wore signet rings that would have the seal of their family, or even a specific seal to themselves, to seal wax with, to say, I endorsed whatever this letter or thing that's being sent is. So for Zerubbabel to be called the signet ring of God, that puts pretty important emphasis on his figure. What we see in Ezra and Nehemiah, and particularly in Ezra, is an emphasis on rebuilding the temple, with a focus on priesthood. Ezra himself is a priest, and the rebuilding of the temple is seen as the most important thing that needs to be done when the Jews return from exile. They build the city, but it's important, they recognize, for them to rebuild this temple so that they have not only a place to worship Yahweh, but in some cases, Yahweh to even be back again. When we get to Nehemiah, this figure, we see more of an emphasis on rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. Now, the walls of Jerusalem were important at this period, mostly to keep out invading countries, with the Sumerians and the Ammonites and other nations surrounding them. Jerusalem was concerned that they would be overtaken by these smaller nations. It also helped if Persia ever decided to rebel against their semi-autonomous province, that they could defend themselves in some way. Nehemiah is a cupbearer for Artaxerxes I, who's a Persian king at this point. Being a cupbearer would be a pretty important role, because this means that the king trusts you enough not to poison his wine, essentially. So what we see here is a semi-autonomous kingdom, but some kind of incorporation into the larger Persian Empire as a whole, with some of the Persians actually trusting the Israelites as much as with their life. One of the chief concerns that we see in Ezra and Nehemiah is with endogamy and quote-unquote foreign women. Now, endogamy is marrying within one's family. This does not necessarily mean very close relatives like siblings or parents, as this is actually outlawed in some of the Torah. But this could be things like marrying a cousin, or marrying a brother-in-law, marrying an uncle. There always seems to be a preference in the Hebrew Bible on endogamy. Instead of marrying outside of one's culture, outside of one's family, it's preferable to marry within. Now we see back in Kings that this is one of the things that Solomon does not do. He has this penchant for foreign women, as we're told in that text. And this is what leads to the downfall of the united monarchy. So Ezra and Nehemiah pick up on this theme and seem to think that endogamy, particularly now that the temple has been rebuilt, now that things are being restored, needs to be restored. One of the reasons for this is because of Jewish identity. Now remember that Judaism is not necessarily just religious. To be a true Jew, one must culturally and hereditarily be Jewish, meaning one's parents must be as well. Now there's discussion over whether the the Israelite tradition at this point is a patriarchal or matrilineal society. Many scholars believe that this was actually a matrilineal society, where the Jewish heritage would pass down through the mother's side rather than the father's. If this was the case, which seems to be indicated by the text of Ezra and Nehemiah, as there's an emphasis on the foreign women, then a Jewish man marrying, for example, a Moabite woman would mean that the children would be Moabites, not Jews, because the mother was Moabite. So the emphasis that we see in Ezra and Nehemiah is not on women sending their foreign husbands away, but on men sending their foreign wives away. Nehemiah in chapter 13, verse 23, talks about this, saying, "In those days also I saw Jews who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab, and half of their children spoke the language of Ashdod, and they could not speak the language of Judah, but spoke the language of various peoples. And I contended with them, and cursed them, and beat some of them, and pulled out their hair. And I made them take an oath in the name of God, saying, You shall not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons, or for yourselves. Did not King Solomon of Israel sin on account of such women? Among the many nations there was no king like him, and he was beloved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, foreign women made even him to sin. Shall we then listen to you, and do all this great evil, and act treacherously against our God by marrying foreign women?" Now these mixed marriages that we see condemned in Nehemiah, which we also see condemned in Ezra 10:44, it says, "All these had married foreign women, and they sent them away with their children." These people were not just people on the sidelines in Jewish culture. These were actually priests. And we get a pretty extensive list of these people in Ezra. Now, it might seem extreme to us for these people to essentially divorce their wives and send away their children simply because they married someone who was foreign. Malachi picks up on this as well. Now, Malachi was a minor prophet at this point, and he writes in chapter 2, verse 16, "For I hate divorce, says the Lord, the God of Israel, covering one's garment with violence, says the Lord of hosts. So take heed to yourselves, and not be faithless." Before this, he talks about everybody being one in the Lord. Both flesh and spirit are his, and so on. Malachi seems to be directly responding to Ezra and Nehemiah, whomever the author of these texts is, saying that yes, it might be preferable to be endogamous, but in this case, divorce is even less preferable. Now that we've reached the end of this video, you should be able to describe the events and key figures that led from the Babylonian exile to the rebuilding of the temple. Explain the difference between the Chronicler's account of history and the account in Samuel and Kings. Explain the rebuilding of the temple and the walls of Jerusalem and the importance of the figures involved. And describe the debate in the Hebrew Bible about endogamy and divorce.